Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. I have a treat for you guys. This is gonna be the Beatles' worst to best discog ranking. It's been a long time coming, and if you know me personally, you know I am very opinionated on the Beatles. We have the crazy boys from Liverpool, John Lennon, Paul McCartney, Ringo Starr, and George Harrison. They were only a band for less than 10 years, and the impact they've made on music in those 10 years are honestly immeasurable. I've always looked at the Beatles in 4 different phases. Phase 1 is Beatlemania, boy band mop top phase, where they released Please Please Me with the Beatles and A Hard Day's Night. Phase 2 is getting more serious and they're driving more into folk rock with Beatles for Sale, Help, and Rubber Soul. Phase 3 is experimental psychedelia with Revolver, Sgt Pepper, and Magical Mystery Tour. Phase 4 is their heaviest and grungiest sound with the White Album, ABY Road, and Let It Be. We have a lot to go through, so let's get started. We all live in a yellow Last place is gonna be Yellow Submarine. Do I even have to explain myself for this one? People unanimously say that Yellow Submarine is their worst album, and I'm one of those people. Side 2 is literally just the instrumental soundtrack for the movie, and there were 2 previously released singles on here. There's 2 unreleased George Harrison songs on here. There's 1 song that Paul would sing at family gatherings, and there's 1 new song on here. So Yellow Submarine is honestly barely an album in the first place. Yellow Submarine is my last pick. It's the worst one. I'm a loser. Next up is gonna be Beatles for Sale. Now, this isn't a bad album per se. It's just the worst of their discography. Obviously excluding Yellow Submarine, which is barely an album. For context, this album was released in 1964, and it was pretty rushed because it was for a Christmas release. So there is a lot of filler on this record. I do like No Reply a lot, and the bloopers for the song are really funny. I know that you saw me, but I looked up to see your face. Cause you walk hand in hand with another man. Your face. They said it wasn't you, but I saw you be through your ways. And Beatles for Sale seems to only be lacking in comparison to the rest of their albums. This was the 4th most popular selling album of 1964. 3rd place being The Times Are A-Changin' by Bob Dylan. 2 being Getz Gilberto by Stan Getz and Joao Gilberto. This is one of my favorite jazz records, by the way. And the highest selling album for 1964 is A Hard Day's Night, the album released after Beatles for Sale. Yeah, Beatles for Sale is great, but it earns the second to last spot. Mother Mary comes to me. Let It Be is next up. I was almost not going to include this because a lot of people don't consider this canon, but I'll include it anyway. I will say Get Back is the song that Joseph Joestar listened to at the end of Battle Tendency JoJo Part 2. Just for that reason, it's better than Beatles for Sale. This is also the album that Paul McCartney despises the most. Many of the songs were recorded during the Get Back sessions, and they were meant to be acoustic and stripped back. But since this was released after the Beatles had broken up, a lot of tweaks and changes were made posthumously. It's not terribly important, it's not a landmark or anything, but it's still a great listen. Strawberry Fields. Next up is going to be Magical Mystery Tour, and this is a compilation album. The song I Am the Walrus, written by John Lennon, is literally about nothing. And John wrote it after learning that the English teacher in his old high school was making their English class study Beatles lyrics. So in response, he just wrote the most confusing lyrics that he could. And that's pretty hilarious. For that reason, I'll put it above Let It Be. Ask me, girl. Please Please Me is next, and this is the Beatles' debut. Fun fact, this was recorded in 1 day. I remember when I record music, it takes me a full day to even record 1 song. And I'm pretty sure I didn't even finish the song. So the fact that they were able to make Please Please Me in 1 day is mind-blowing. The thing I like about this album is that it shows an aspect of the Beatles that a lot of people tend to gloss over. Yes, they were great songwriters. Yes, they were talented vocalists and instrumentalists. Yes, they were innovative and creative in the studio. And yes, they were forward-thinking and they were just plain cool. But Please Please Me shows that they were just a damn good 4-piece rock band. And for that reason, I'm placing it above Magical Mystery Tour. Please Please Me is really good. Till there was you. With the Beatles is next. The funniest thing about this album is the album cover itself. Ringo is at the bottom because the Beatles almost unanimously decided that Ringo is the least talented in the group. They also mentioned the fact that Ringo was the worst songwriter. He was also the last to join the band, and he was also the shortest. The song Roll Over Beethoven pays homage to Chuck Berry's Johnny B. Good. Till There Was You is a cover from the musical Music Man. With the Beatles is a progression in the sound that they were making on Please Please Me. So for that reason, I'm putting it above it.
Yesterday.
Help is next. This is effortless pop which anticipates some of the more experimental sounds that they would be using on their later albums. And this is the first album where they really started diversifying their sound. Help is their first great leap in songwriting. They stopped looking to top their previous hits, and they instead went outside the box, trusting their intuition, trusting their talent. Stepping out of your comfort zone as an artist in 1965 probably did more harm than good for you. But even then, they were too big to fail at this point in their career anyway. Taking risks like that helped them with their confidence to become even more experimental down the road. Do we get Rubber Soul if people didn't like the song Yesterday? Would they have instead gone back to old Beatlemania sounds to appease their fans? It's pretty interesting to think about. You're Gonna Lose That Girl is probably their last pure pop song that they've ever recorded as well. A lot of people think that Rubber Soul and Revolver are the Volta of their discography, but I think that Help and Rubber Soul are the actual true Voltas of their discography.
And I love her.
Next up is A Hard Day's Night. And this is the first album with no cover songs. Beatles fans will collectively say that A Hard Day's Night is the best pre-Rubber Soul Beatles album. And I agree with them. It's the most John Lennon-centered album they've ever done. And of course it's gonna be great. And I Love Her and If I Fell are my favorite pre-Rubber Soul Beatles tracks. The album just sounds so good. The album sounds fresh even today. And for that, I'm gonna place it above Help. Revolver is next. The Beatles call Revolver Part 2 of Rubber Soul. It makes sense when you realize that Revolver was released only 8 months after Rubber Soul was. How is that for high quality output? Can you imagine any other band doing that? And to follow up Revolver with Sgt Pepper only 9 months later? Unbelievable. Also, this is probably their most even album in terms of singer-songwriting division. John and Paul have 5 songs, George has 3 songs, and Ringo gets 1 song. Also, the variety of the songs on this album is crazy. It's usually regarded as a psychedelic rock album, but I honestly see it as just a mini White album. This is also the last time we see John Lennon as a leader in the band. After this, Paul is shown as taking over and taking the creative direction of the band. Here, There, and Everywhere is one of my favorite songs because my dad used it as a Haranista for my mom. Eleanor Rigby and Love You Too are extremely weird songs to have on a pop record, but they work. Tomorrow Never Knows is one of the best Beatles songs of all time. John's melody is a perfect fit for his lyrics. Paul's tape loops are hypnotic. The one really pulling it all together is Ringo and his drumming. The moment his drums kick in on Tomorrow Never Knows, there's just a sense of momentum that keeps the entire song building. It's really, really good. For that, Revolver earns a top 5 spot.
I read the news today.
Sgt Pepper is next. There's a reason that Sgt Pepper is often ranked the #1 album of all time. This is the turning point where Paul McCartney took a pseudo-leadership role in the Beatles. In fact, this is Paul McCartney's favorite, but this is Ringo, John, and George's least favorite album. George says he loves the first half of the record, but he hates the second half of the record. I honestly think the album sounds really good front to back. They invented a lot of studio techniques on this album. For example, having songs leading to each other, just like With a Little Help from My Friends. The recording innovations of Sgt Pepper brought the psychedelic era of music to the mainstream. And it also inspired thousands of other artists to be experimental in the studio. You have to consider what it was like throwing this on a vinyl player in 1967. By that point, the Beatles have already made several albums, a lot of which are pop rock. After releasing something as experimental as Revolver, people were expecting the Beatles to go in a new direction. The novelty of Sgt Pepper is that it is an encapsulation of 60s culture. I've always imagined that Sgt Pepper has become legendary because of the hype of the time, and that the hype never really died out. But personally, looking at their discography, I think it is the #4. Next up is the White Album. For me, I would say this is a combination of their absolute best and worst songs. But it all works out. Like the album cover, this album is a blank slate. It's This is a canvas for the Beatles to just throw ideas onto. And this is John's favorite as well, saying, I wrote a lot of good shit on that. I like all the stuff I did on that. And the other stuff as well. I like the whole album. This album is about raw experimentation. Just throwing ideas onto a wall and seeing what sticks. The sheer number of styles on the White Album is intimidating. From hard rock to blues to psychedelic to Disney-esque ballads to heavy metal to folk to western to show tunes. It's got everything. If you listen to Revolution No. 9, Honey Pie, Blackbird, and Helter Skelter, there's almost no way you'd believe that they were made by the same band, let alone on the same album. But they are, and the album works despite everything. For that reason, White Album is going to be number 3. Abbey Road is next. The entire album is extremely strong front to back. I personally prefer side 2. The Abbey Road medley is a stretch of 9 unfinished songs that the Beatles put together in one epic rhapsody. The entire back half of the album flows so well, it is mind-blowingly good. Also, the transition from She's So Heavy to Here Comes the Sun is something where the intentional experience is sort of lost on modern streaming platforms. On the original vinyl, while listening to I Want You, the end drones for on and on as if it's gonna keep going on for infinity. And the song would abruptly end, which is a cue for you to flip the vinyl to the next side. Instead, you would be greeted with the beautiful opening chords of Here Comes the Sun. It's a song welcoming you out of the abyss that I Want You, She's So Heavy was pulling you into. I think the effect sort of still works on streaming services, but put yourself into the shoes of someone who bought the vinyl in 1969. That would be mind-blowing. I remember playing I Want You, She's So Heavy in the car, and my mom sighed of relief when the song ended. The Beatles defined what rock should sound like, and they perfected what the sound is on Abbey Road. There's not much I can say that hasn't already been said. And honestly, most people say this is their number 1 pick. But next up is one of my favorite albums of all time.
Till I come back to your side.
Next up is my beloved Rubber Soul. Rubber Soul. This is also George Harrison's favorite album. George Harrison seemed to value the feeling of being in a simple band, and he didn't quite have an affinity towards the more complex studio work that they would do after they stopped touring. This is the sound influenced by Bob Dylan and marijuana. And this is the album that inspired the Beach Boys to create Pet Sounds, which then inspired the Beatles to create Sgt Pepper. Norwegian Wood is the first pop song to use a sitar, and the song is also in 6/8, and the song also has a book adaptation that I've read that is extremely good. Girl, Michelle, Wait, In My Life are all S-tier Beatles songs. If you have hung out with me for any considerable amount of time, I have probably talked to you about how much I love Rubber Soul. I think it is the best folk pop album of all time. There are weeks where I literally just listen to Rubber Soul, and I'm completely happy with that. The Beatles dove into the world of folk on Rubber Soul, and I love how they executed it. I know it's a controversial pick for the number 1 Beatles album of all time, but go ahead and listen to the top 5 in my list. I honestly think they're all pretty interchangeable in the ranks. All right, that was my Beatles worst to best album ranking. Did you like my ranking? Did you hate my ranking? Do you agree with me at all? Anything is okay, because I'm just here to share my opinion. Thank you.